Welcome to my International Dimensions video, which will focus on how globalization and education impacts the empowerment of women and reduce gender disparity in sub-Saharan countries, by Abigail Brewster, B1507977. Gender equality is recognized as both a core developmental goal and a human right, and is defined as every person having the right to live a fulfilling life according to his or her own values and aspirations. However, as expressed in the United Nations Development Programme, or UNDP, gender inequality remains among the most persistent forms of inequality across all countries, and is arguably one of the greatest barriers to human development. Did you know that in sub-Saharan Africa, 1 in every 180 women dies giving birth? This is more than 20 times the ratio in developed countries. And adult women are less educated and have less access to labour markets than men in most regions, and lack political power. This is an example of gender inequality in the 21st century identified by the United Nations Development Programme in 2019. The lack of education and resulting disempowerment of women has had a detrimental impact on the gender disparity in developing countries. The UNDP strongly advocates that gender equality is not only a fundamental human right, but a precondition for sustainable development, thus indicating the urgency in addressing gender inequality to promote basic human rights. This raises the question of how best to confront and reduce gender disparity, as effectively applying strategies for closing the gender gap will go a long way towards reducing inequality and eliminating poverty. Reducing gender disparity in sub-Saharan Africa and other developing countries has been a persistent challenge internationally tackled by many developmental organisations and policies, including those formed and implemented by the United Nations. In 2015, the United Nations adopted a new agenda called the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, following the failure of the previous Millennium Development Goals, which were established in 2000. In 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals were outlined by the United Nations in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The two most relevant goals that will be focused on in this video include Goal 4, which is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all, and Goal 5, which aims to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls by 2030. Since the implementation of these goals, progress in reducing gender inequality over the 20th century has been remarkable in basic achievement in health and education, as well as participation in markets and politics. However, as stressed in the UNDP, the world is not on track to achieve gender equality by 2030, and based on current trends, it will take 202 years to close the gender gap in economic opportunity. Based on this known evidence that education raises aspirations and outcomes for women, which is encouraged by Goal 4 of the SDGs, it is clear that education is important in reducing gender disparity, especially considering the urgency of the current situation and for the following generations. World Bank research has shown that women with even a few years of basic education are economically more productive, have smaller, healthier families, and are more likely to send their own children to school. It is therefore imperative that gender inequality in education is addressed and that all children have access to equitable and quality education. The gender gap in education is closing, but despite this, throughout the world there are 113 million children still not in school. 2/3 of these are girls, and the majority live in sub-Saharan countries. Inclusive education is fundamental in regards to gender equality and societal development, as gender equality in and through education is considered key to realizing inclusive education and global social justice. The Education for All movement, or EFA, led by UNESCO, addresses the current gender gap in education. It advocates towards gender parity in developing countries and is supported by a number of international organisations, including the World Bank and national aid agencies such as DFID. Gender parity has been a priority for the EFA movement, as girls make up the majority of out-of-school children globally, Thus, the Education for All movement has become a key component of international aid and development. The achievement of education for all has been a central goal of the international development community since the end of the Second World War, when the right to education, irrespective of gender, was first articulated in Article 26 of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As expressed by the United Nations, everyone has the right to education, as well as education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and to strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. In order to understand how the Education for All movement can be implemented in developing countries, it is important to consider the wider impacts such as globalization. This has played a key role in establishing societal values and opinions in countries all around the world, and continues to influence the ongoing attempts to reduce gender disparity by facilitating the education and empowerment of women. Bartlett and Burton define globalization as a process that has been generated increasing interest for politicians, educationalists, and industrialists alike in terms of its impact across the world. The world culture theory identified by Shields views globalization primarily as a diffusion of cultural values, which are embodied in the declarations of internal organizations. World culture theory therefore ascribes a very central role in education, as education is one of the primary transmitters of world culture. International dimensions, for example the role of UNESCO and the World Bank in the EFA movement, also play a key role in the spread of these values by extending access to primary education to many children. Globalization, therefore, expands opportunities for women and girls through promoting their economic, social, and political participation and improving their access to social protection, employment, and natural resources, which in turn makes economies more productive. Globalization is a potential tool for empowerment, and through this perspective, globalization and education go hand in hand in providing benefits for women, and also points to opening of opportunities for women. When utilized effectively, this can help tackle gender disparities. An example of this is through an increase in communication technologies, which have had the potential to connect women to markets and economic opportunities, alongside reshaping attitudes and norms among women and men about gender relations, and thus encouraging countries to promote gender equality. It is clear that globalization is a fact of life. The challenge now is to ensure that it is also a force for good. Unfortunately, there are still various barriers to education remaining that girls have to face in sub-Saharan countries, such as poverty, child marriage, and gender inequality. Gender gaps persist where girls and women face other disadvantages, as these disparities are even larger when poverty combines with other forms of exclusion, such as remoteness, ethnicity, and disability. This is an example of the concept of intersectionality, whereby in the context, inequalities are identified which affect access to education, such as gender, disabilities, and ethnicity. Women and girls suffer particular disadvantages in education where two or more aspects of their identity intersect, as represented through the fact that 2/3 of out-of-school girls worldwide are also from ethnic minority groups in their countries. Programs such as the DFID trial, called IMAGE, was implemented in South Africa. It seeks to reduce these barriers to education and aims to ensure that gender equality and women's rights are central to development. IMAGE combines microfinance with gender and HIV education and offers women the opportunity to set up their own business, become economically self-sufficient, and thus challenge negative attitudes within the community. Furthermore, the UNICEF Gender Action Plan was initiated in 2018 in order to further promote gender equality through its work. In alignment to the Sustainable Development Goals, the UNICEF's ambitions, among others, includes that by 2021, they aim to reach 6.5 million girls with employability, learning, citizenship, and empowerment programs. I now raise the question as to whether the promotion of cultural heritage could help gender equality in developing countries, by empowering women through education. As previously mentioned, globalization facilitates the transmission of cultural values or heritage, as heritage and gender equality enjoy a mutually reinforcing and dynamic relationship, with tremendous potential for supporting and achieving development goals. The United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, stresses that by applying gender disparity to heritage, therefore exposes the extent to which women remain largely unrecognized or undervalued in sub-Saharan countries. For example, in Uganda, the recognition of women's roles in society is enabled by an e-learning tool developed by UNESCO in 2013. This tool allows an insight into women in African history and reinforces the traditional leadership roles of women in their communities. Gender equality is enhanced through this creative tool, which was designed by young comic strip artists from across Africa, by highlighting the contributions of African women as key figures in the process of development. The Nkoma Outreach Programme in Ghana further encapsulates the importance of education. This programme was founded in 2012 and aims to ensure that every child has the opportunity of education and that every individual has access to healthcare and good sanitation levels are maintained. This programme therefore supports the fourth SDG goal, as well as working towards removing the barriers to education identified earlier through the intersectionality concept. This ensures that women and girls can become empowered through education, and in turn work towards reducing gender disparity in less developed countries. According to the UNDP Report 2019, Africa has experienced one of the most significant improvements in human development as measured by the Human Development Index. Between 1990 and 2018, life expectancy increased by more than 11 years. This is corroborated by the Gender Gap Report 2020, which outlines that sub-Saharan Africa has closed 68% of its gender gap so far. This result represents significant progress, which leads to a decline in the number of years it will take to close the gender gap, now estimated at 95 years. At the beginning of this video, I asked the question, how does globalization and education impact the empowerment of women and reduce gender disparity in sub-Saharan countries? In conclusion, gender parity in sub-Saharan countries is the overall goal, through which globalization and education play vital roles in facilitating gender equality through the process of empowering women. It is now clear that globalization makes the imperative for education for all movement even more urgent, as if women are truly to share in the benefits, they must be free to develop skills and knowledge to empower them to engage in the global marketplace on their own terms, and with no barriers to learning and growth. Realizing gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls will make a crucial contribution to progress across all the goals and targets, as how can we expect the achievement of full human potential and of sustainable development if one half of humanity continues to be denied its full human rights and opportunities? Thank you for listening.